at our very first conference 3 years ago, looking at the first Howard government, we had a panel discussion of those who were elected for the first time in 1996 to talk about that experience, the experience of campaigning, but also the experience of victory in March of 1996. We're going to replay a form of that conversation this afternoon. So I'm delighted that our three panellists offer us three different perspectives on 2007. If I could ask you though, if you would take up in your conference booklet, you'll notice towards the rear, Kay Elson, who was a member of the Howard government, was not seeking re-election at the end of 2007. She was to join us also as part of the panel, but unfortunately she had a serious injury, hurting her knee, and she can't be with us, but she was so keen to participate that I asked her for her text. So you'll find her text, her perspective from the seat of Ford, which is included in the conference booklet, which you might kind of hold in consideration with what you're going to hear from our three speakers this afternoon. The format will be this. I'll ask each of them to speak just for 10 minutes about what it was like to campaign and their sense of whether or not they had a sense that defeat was inevitable. I'm going to ask Gary Nairn to speak first because as the member for Eden-Monaro, the to that time bellwether seat, whoever won Eden-Monaro would deliver government for their own party. Gary was with us in 1996 and he talked about that experience. So Gary will speak first from the perspective of Eden-Monaro and how it looked, the view from Queanbeyan, you might say. And then Phil Baresi. Phil was elected in 1996 but didn't survive the 2007 election. So he served throughout the Howard years and didn't have anything to base it on previously as parliamentary experience. But we're keen to hear about how Phil saw it as someone who did lose his seat. And the third person who's going to speak is Dr. Brendan Nelson. Brendan, of course, was in, if not the safest seat in the country, certainly it was the second safest seat.
I worked very hard to make it marginal, but it was still strong. Yeah.
In the seat of Bradfield. So for Brendan, it wasn't a case of thinking he'd lose his seat, but how was it feeling that perhaps if the coalition did lose, what would the leadership arrangements be at the end of that time? So we're in for a great discussion. We'll ask each of them to speak for 10 minutes, then perhaps to comment on each other's experience, where it was similar, where it was different, and then we'll invite you to offer some perspective. So can I ask Gary if you'd speak to us?
Thanks, Tom, and gee, it's hard to follow Warren and Keating last, but I don't think anybody ever drew a cartoon of me during my parliamentary career, although there was a cartoon by Pryor once that showed the House of Representatives, and at the back of it there was somebody set up with a theodolite looking through and it was surveying the political landscape, and I thought, oh well, that must be me, having been a surveyor all my life before Parliament, so that was the closest I got, I think. In retrospect, our final term in government, for me personally, was one of huge highs and very low lows. The 2004 election, my fourth consecutive win, was extremely satisfying as it resulted in an increased margin from the 2001 election. It went up by another 0.5%. 2001 I improved a couple of percent. So I was feeling, I really felt at that time that I'd developed a very strong support from a wide cross-section of the community. The type of support that comes when you know you're receiving votes from certain individuals because they are voting specifically for you and not for the party that you represent. So I think, contrary to Murray's view yesterday, I think the local member can definitely make a difference, and it probably increases as you remain the member. The second high was my elevation to Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. I admit I had been disappointed not to get promoted after the 2001 election, so the opportunity to work closely with Prime Minister Howard was very exciting, and my responsibilities, which included the National Water Initiative and the National Water Commission, added to that excitement. So I was in there, Nick, when you talked about those responsibilities. I handed that over to Malcolm Turnbull, who, when I became Special Minister of State, and he took on that role of PALSEC. The highs of an election win and promotion were quickly overrun a few weeks later when my wife of 31 years was diagnosed with a terminal cancer. We lost her a short 21 weeks later. In hindsight, my roles as the federal member for Eden-Monaro, Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, and ultimately in early 2006, when I was appointed Special Minister of State, were really lifesavers. Being extremely busy was of great benefit to the grieving process. The start of, while the weeks leading up to my wife's passing were obviously difficult, they were made more difficult as it coincided with the start of a determined personal attack by some extreme elements in my electorate. For example, my office received a number of offensive phone calls. I received unwelcome phone calls during the early hours of the morning at home. An apparent box of chocolates mailed to my electorate office was in fact a box of faeces. And an anti-forestry campaigner forged my letterhead and signature to write to a small business in the forestry industry informing them that the government was withdrawing a previously announced grant. The culprit, identified by police, was ultimately wrapped over the knuckles by the House of Representatives Privileges Committee. Incredibly, she had received similar treatment from the Senate back in the 1980s when she harassed Brian Harradine, coincidentally when his wife had cancer. It was really quite a bizarre period. Personal attack and intimidation continued at an intense level, particularly over the final year or so leading up to the 2007 election. This was the beginning of the organisation Get Up, and they had Eden-Monaro as a target. Their campaigning coincided with the union's Your Rights at Work, and these two organisations, along with the Labor Party, developed a very well-coordinated campaign against the government and me in Eden-Monaro. Even the colouring of the three organisations, Get Up, Unions and Labor, was much the same. They were all orange. Throughout the final year, I had the uneasy experience of a certain individual showing up at almost every event I attended, displaying various protest and anti-NAN signage. At times we were clearly being followed, such that we went to great lengths to lose people at times. Post the 2007 election, I was reliably told my protagonists had been paid by the unions for 12 months to basically pester me. So I understand what Nicole Flint went through at the recent election. In my view, the most difficult issue to deal with during the final term was our workplace relations policy, work choices. In hindsight, but only in political terms, it was a bridge too far for the electorate to accept. We had made some excellent progress and the electorate saw the additional step as unnecessary, and it opened up the opportunity for our opponents to play with the facts and therefore create huge concern in the community. As others have said already over the last 2 days, our handling, timing, marketing didn't help us. On top of the element of time, given we were seeking a fifth term, resulted in what I would describe a reasonably complacent electorate, made an easy decision to let the other mob have a go. Rudd, portraying himself as Howard Light, gave the electorate confidence that nothing much would change over then than maybe a few new ideas to add to the great stability that they'd experienced over the previous almost 12 years. A level of disunity in our own ranks didn't help. For example, a particular senator elected in 2004, not up for re-election therefore in that campaign, conducting policy debate at the doorstep rather than actually in the party room. And I think disunity plays out much worse in a marginal seat than anywhere. That mood to change was very evident throughout my electorate over the final 6 months. People sensed the country was going to change governments, and as had occurred at every single election since 1972, the people of Eden-Monaro would ensure that their member be part of the new government. So losing on the 24th of November 2007 did not come as a surprise. While the swing away from me was over 6% and my margin had been 2.5% after the 2004 election, The result may have been a lot closer, or I could have held on if not for a very contentious redistribution. Following the 2004 election, due to growth in Queensland, New South Wales lost one electorate, so a redistribution was required. Interestingly, the 2004 boundaries for Eden Monaro still contain the correct number of voters required by the redistribution quota, so Eden Monaro had grown proportionally. But due to the way in which the redistribution committee went about their boundary changes, a section of coastal Eden Monaro, including Bateman's Bay and its surround, was transferred to Gilmore. Therefore, those numbers lost had to be made up, and they did that by going over the mountains for the very first time, with Tumut and Tumbarumba added to Eden Monaro. Bateman's Bay was a reasonably strong area for me, where I had nurtured that support progressively over each election since 1996. Tumut and Tumbarumba were dominated by the timber manufacturing industry, an industry with strong union control. So a completely new area, quite separated from Eden Monaro's traditional area, a unionised workforce replaced a significant Bateman's Bay population that had been voting in Eden Monaro forever. Additionally, Tumut and Tumbarumba had been shifted between electorates several times over the past decade, so the locals were fed up with being used as redistribution pawns, as a number of people described it to me. I mention this process in detail as between 2007 and 2010, another redistribution occurred and the boundaries of Eden Monaro reverted to the 2004 boundaries. At the time, the 2007 redistribution made no sense, and to see the boundaries revert to 2004 boundaries in 2010 was quite frustrating. If I'd fought the 2007 election on the 2004 boundaries, I know the result would have been so much closer. But close enough, we'll never know. Ironically, as Special Minister of State, I had ministerial responsibility for the Australian Electoral Commission, but obviously was unable to influence the Redistribution Committee's decisions. Finally, the rise of climate activism also worked against me. I don't think we had a clear narrative, and what we did have, which was talked about, the policy that Roger Beale mentioned, came probably too late. There was really strong activists, particularly in the Bega area of my electorate. It was promoted by a respected local orthopaedic surgeon. Labor simply sort of barracked along behind those groups, and even some good initiatives that I did put in place were just simply matched by Labor along the way. So in summary, time, work choices, internal disunity, climate, redistribution, summed up a result that I pretty much thought would occur. I had the great privilege of coming in with John Howard in '96, and I had the great privilege of going out with John Howard in 2007. It was a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Gary, just one point to help us. When did you think, or when were you convinced that you were not going to win in 2007?
Probably 6 months out. I could see that it was going to be horribly difficult. But I suppose you always work your little butt off and hope for something to change. Because in many respects, I survived '98 by 250 votes in 88,000. Took 10 days for that decision, so it was always a tricky electorate. 2001, 6 months out. 2004, 6 months out, we weren't looking real crash-hot either. So a lot did change, but I suppose I really felt people had become very relaxed and comfortable and thought that they could play with the devil and something might come along. And you really had that feeling that they just thought, they've been great, they've been terrific, but we'll give this other mob a go.
Now, you have in the conference booklet, I'm sad to say, a slightly dated biography for Phil Baresi. Can I also add, because this might help you make sense of what he shares, he's also has been a director of the board of National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation. He's recently completed a term on the board of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, a position he held for almost 3 years, based in the UK. He's a former CEO of a leading energy industry association, so the matters that Roger was dealing with this morning are ones that are not unknown to Phil. And he's also served, as I mentioned before, as a parliamentarian for 12 years. We've looked forward to hearing how he saw things. Please welcome Phil Beazley.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks for the invitation to be here for the last 2 days. To my leader, John Howard, great always to be in the same room as John. His level of energy is still amazes me in terms of what he's able to do. Phil Ruddock, the minister who I worked with for many years, chairing one of his committees, and Michael Danby, who's here, and my two colleagues on stage, Gary Nairn, and the guy I shared accommodation with in the famous hockey mansion in Brendan, someone who had been particularly considerate of my needs over the years when it mattered. I want to say, but I want to commence by stating that to have served 4 successive terms of the Howard government is one of my greatest honours. So I will start where Gary left off. I'll always be indebted to John for his leadership and his support. And to be part of a historic period of our nation has been a privilege. John began the 2004 term as a hero, an undoubted loved leader of the conservative liberals of conservative liberal supporters in the country. But then, very soon after that, things started to go south. Why? And I want to give some of my insights. Some of it has actually already been covered. Gary covered a little bit. Other speakers yesterday and today also covered some of the issues. So bear with me if it might be repetitive in parts. Leading up to the 2004 election, we had proved to be a successful team, brimming with talent. The reasons for our success had largely to do with John's leadership, his insightful understanding of the electorate, and our outstanding economic management. In a sense, all these attributes bore the seeds of the eventual demise only 3 years later. So I actually concur with a part of the analysis from Michael Danby yesterday. In 2004, we won 87 seats. We gained a national swing of 5.5%, and we won control of the Senate. In my own electorate of Deakin, we won it for the very first time in decades on primary votes. I had a 5.5% swing, and we won an unprecedented 30 out of 36 polling booths. It was an emphatic electoral mandate at a national and an electorate level. During our previous terms, we had developed a reputation as good economic managers. Tax reform, waterfront reform, asset privatisation, signing new trade agreements, and taking control of our borders. These were part of our success. Our supporters, those cheering on the sidelines, were demanding greater reforms to tackle further economic growth and strengthen the economy. In the Parliament, we had discussed the ongoing challenges of intergenerational growth, the 3 Ps, population, participation and productivity. We had created both a thirst for more cutting-edge reforms within the party room and an electorate that was experiencing a lengthy period of prosperity. Paradoxically, these twin forces worked against us, and we did not respond in a manner that satisfied the electorate. Instead, we responded by embarking on labour market reforms that failed to marshal the promised support in the community, in the electorate, to counter the highly structured and community-based opposition. Work Choices was born. 2 government ministers held the job of selling it to the electorate, first Kevin Andrews, and then the more retail-oriented politician in Joe Hockey. The Work Choices Task Force was established, first chaired by Andrew Robb, and in the dying days of the 4th term by myself. A task force really with no real power to change direction. In fact, the very opposite. It had been entrenched as a policy position within the government. In fact, I recall having my loyalties to the party questioned by a senior staffer in the PM's office, and John would not have been aware of this, So that, to me, it indicated that the idealistic pursuit of the cause trumped the pragmatics and the electorate feedback that might take place. The success of the economy was a big part of our demise, as the public thought the good times would keep on rolling. So if you try and explain this through in my early days when I was a psychologist, through the prism of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the electorate, whilst not concerned for themselves, certainly turned their mind to the altruistic concern for their fellow citizens, their sons and daughters, and their job security. We also witnessed at the time the beginning of a divisive debate, which is ongoing to this day, in climate change. Our failure to ratify Kyoto played into the perception of who we were as a government. Union coordinators, together with a fledgling Get Up organisation, were established and well-resourced and paid electorate campaign teams. So for the first time, we had paid officials, paid campaign teams in the electorate, working for a lengthy period of time, up to 2 to 2.5 years. Local as well as external nurses, teachers, ambos, fireys. These were occupations that are respected by the community as they engaged in door knocking in the entire electorate, letter writing campaigns and establishing community action groups. They penetrated all parts of the electorate. Who did we have? We had highly dedicated, highly loyal, but a very ageing band of volunteers. Volunteers who were easily intimidated by the union movement whenever they came across them in shopping centres and in the streets. Our response was twofold, a national response and a local response. I get the national response. At a national level, a program of community industry consultation took place across the country. As a marginal seat member, it was difficult for me to accompany Joe on his extensive roadshow. When I could, I joined him. It was on a series of such meetings in Melbourne with the retail, hospitality sectors that Joe and I both realised that we were deeply in danger. We came across example after example of individual employment contracts, the AWAs, being templated to do away with basic entitlements. In one such organisation, they had written up to 400 in 1 week. Changes needed to be made to the initial work choices legislation, and some changes were made. But no amount of fine-tuning would overcome the entrenched opposition from the union movement, with the Labor Party daily bringing up examples of workers who were portrayed as being exploited. Not surprisingly, Deakin, my electorate, was earmarked as a key battlefield, as were Latrobe, McEwen, Corangamite and Dunkley down in Victoria. I recall midway through the 4th term, the then opposition Foreign Affairs spokesman, Kevin Rudd, who I knew, coming up to me and advising me to take a low profile because they'll come to get you, Phil. I thank Kevin, even though he ended up being the opposition leader after that time. I dismissed his concerns. I remained, in answer to your question, Tom, to Gary, I remained cautiously optimistic, despite that heavy presence from the union movement and the campaign that ensued. Firstly, it was my belief that there's no such thing as an election result which being inevitable. I did not believe the 2000 election result was in the bag for the ALP. However, when the starter's gun went up, we certainly started from behind. The highly conservative ends of my electorate, and Nick Economou, who lives in my then electorate, would know this. Those highly conservative ends, Blackburn, North Ringwood, Heathmont, the Bellbird parts of the electorate, strong Christian Baptist communities, had over successive years started to turn against us on social issues. The neighbourhood street meetings were becoming more and more hostile. At a local level, we were advised early on to fight the election on local issues. So the comment about a local MP can't make a difference, that's what we were being asked to do, is to retreat back to being local. emphasise our achievements, our track record, our personal affinity with the electorate on those local issues. It had worked in the past. The famous Scoresby No Tolls campaign, various Black Spots campaigns, this means something to people in Victoria, by the way, were very significant and resonated in the electorate. In fact, I was making traction on one key election promise, the undergrounding of the rail line on Springvale Road in Nunawading. And I was convinced that that would get me over the line. It was very, very powerful. And I recall having a conversation with the then opposition spokesperson on roads, Martin Ferguson, saying federal government should not be involved in funding of these suburban road projects. So I felt good in that statement, and I thanked Martin. I think Martin was eventually overruled by the party because within two weeks of the campaign, the ALP matched the funding. And in fact, they did that time and time again. As we reverted to local issues, local promises, splashing out the cash, they neutralised that local advantage by simply matching our funding. We were buying tracts of land to preserve for environmental purposes when the council should have been doing that. There were areas of federal government intervention which were new at the time in terms of funding. These days, it's second nature. So at that time, my heart sank. The other significant point, and John may recall this, on October 30th or 31st, which was about 2 or 3 days after the election was called, we thought some of the press was starting to be favourable, if not neutral, at least to us. There was a decision to launch the health policy in my electorate. So all the heavy hitters turned up to this medical centre in Blackburn. John was there, Jeanette was there, Peter Costello, Tanya, senators, all the Victorian senators, were all there. What happened in that very first week? The minister turned up over 1 hour late, perhaps even later, so we're all waiting around. The Bernie Banton attack had taken place the night before. The Nicola Roxon ministerial debate here happened. It took us off message. And from that moment in the campaign, when you're hoping to have a positive start in an election campaign, we were already on the back foot and we're trying to recover from a very difficult position. But despite the setback and the union head office presence and Dean Mile and all his cohorts, I still remained optimistic. But they had pre-selected a union official, they had pre-selected someone from the ETU, someone from the electorate who was well regarded at one end of the electorate. It was tough. It was not to be. I had a swing of 6.4% and I won 8 out of the 36 booths. I couldn't have done anything more. In summary, all I can say is that we couldn't match their advertising dollars, we couldn't match their message, we certainly couldn't counter the link between me and work choices, which was very difficult in the electorate. So I was already starting from a back foot there. The electorate knew John well. They knew he was a man of conviction. They shared his convictions in part up to 2007, but in that last couple of months, those convictions were no longer shared and they were looking for a change. I have to respond with one point because I keep getting asked this question as a Victorian. Would a change of leadership have made a difference? First of all, when it was mooted, no, absolutely not a single iota of a difference. Would have made a difference early on the term? Perhaps, but we'll never know. It may have saved me, but I'm yet to be convinced that it would have saved the government. Thank you, and thank you, John, for the opportunity to have served with you.
"25 years ago, I interviewed John Gorton. I said, did you ever think you would be the leader of the Liberal Party? And he said, why would I have? And unexpected events meant that, surprisingly, John Gorton ended up being Harold Holt's successor. I would almost bet that 6 months out from the 2007 election, Brendan Nelson wouldn't have expected that he would have been John Howard's successor, but that's what he faced. So to give his perspective on the party moving towards the election and then what it would mean for him and for others, we look forward to hearing from Dr. Brendan Nelson.
Thank you very much, Tom, and congratulations on what you and Andrew and your team have done with this series. It's a great contribution to our nation. It is a real privilege, it's an overused word, to be here with Gary and Phil. We went through a lot together as colleagues, as friends, our personal lives, so wonderful. And of course, John Howard. What I'm about to say to you is obviously a personal opinion. All of you will have a different view of some of these things. They're based on my own observations and experiences, and Philip Ruddock in particular, who's a former highly respected cabinet colleague, will have a different view on some of them. So in that context, I'll now speak to you, having been asked to by Tom about the transition and the leadership. I didn't really get to know Peter Costello until after we lost. Strange thing to say when you've been a member of a government in which Peter Costello has been a towering figure for 11 and a half years. All of us, Gary, Philip, Kay Olsen and many others, we saw his brilliance. We saw his tactical and strategic dominance of the Parliament. We saw him create, craft and deliver budgets. But most of us didn't really know him. In the very limited time that you have as a treasurer to socialise with colleagues, Peter basically had a dozen of our colleagues with whom he socialised. They're perfectly entitled to do, of course. But one of the products of that was that the rest of us didn't really get to know the man. The man that I discovered after we lost in 2007, Peter Costello, is not only intelligent, decisive, witty. I also discovered a man deeply committed to his wife and his family, a man embedded and imbued with very strong and deep values, no less than John Howard, but also in a strange sense, a man paradoxically a little shy and a little risk averse. So in that context, after the 1993 election, which was 2019 in reverse, the fight-back election, if you like, in which John Hewson had lost the unlosable election, the morning after that election on the Sunday program, Laurie Oakes was interviewing Graham Richardson, who'd played a significant role, obviously, in keeping us out of government through the period of the Hawke and Keating governments. And Richardson, when asked who should lead the Liberal Party, said, "There is only one person in the Liberal Party that will come within a bull's roar of worrying us, and that's John Howard." And so, of course, the rest, as they say, is history. My experiences as a member of the government, along with Gary and Phil elected in 1996, that informed my support and sustained support of John Howard when others, including in my own electorate in Bradfield in the upper North Shore of Sydney, were asking me, "Brendan, it's time for a change." I started getting that particularly after the 2004 election. It's time, many of the constituents were saying, for a change in the leadership to, of course, Peter Costello. The first, there are many of these that I had, and I'm sure that Gary and Phil had similar ones, but the first I had was that after the 2001 election, in which I had been the Parliamentary Secretary for Defence that year, I received a phone call about a week after the election from John Howard, and he asked me if I would go into the Cabinet as the Minister for Education, Science and Training, and of course I said yes. And he said to me, when he was on the phone, he said, "There are two things I'd like to say to you, Brendan, while I'm talking to you." He said, "The first is that you would have noticed after the 1998 election that two of your colleagues in New South Wales were promoted and you weren't," referring to Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey. And I said, "Yes, Prime Minister." And he said, "And I gave you the worst job I could give anybody. I'll put you in charge of running the noise abatement programs at Sydney Airport. Certainly, truthful statement. He said, you must have been extremely upset about that. And I said, well, I was. And he said, well, what I admire about it is that nobody knew. You just got on with the job. You did the best job you could. He said, the second thing I want to say to you is, in coming into the Cabinet, he said, you and I have different views on some things. And I want you to bring those views and bring those opinions to the Cabinet. That speaks to character. And in my current role in particular, I remind people every day that what transcends everything in life, rank, power, money, influence, intellect, looks and talent, is character, informed by worthwhile intrinsic values. To speak again to the character of John Howard and why most of us remained with John Howard through to 2007, on Sunday night before the 2004 election, I had arrived in Launceston late on a Sunday afternoon to speak to a large audience, obviously electioneering. And I received news that my father had just died in Adelaide. It was impossible for me to get out of Launceston to go to Adelaide. Anyway, I did what I had to do as a minister and speak to this audience, and it was about 1:45. It was the night of the NRL final, grand final. And I had just gone to sleep and my phone rang. And it was John Howard. And John Howard was on the phone having heard that my father had died and spent not 2 minutes talking to me, but he spent the best part of 15 minutes talking to me about me, encouraging me to talk about my father. John spoke about his father. You never forget that. And then one of the most difficult experiences that I went through as Minister of Defence in April 2006 was the death of Private Jake Kovco in Baghdad. As you know, the wrong body had been repatriated to Australia, and I had an extremely difficult family experience at the Sale RAF base with an extremely distressed Mrs Kovco, the widow, and I put her on. She wanted to speak to Mr Howard, who'd gone to sleep. As quite right, it was late at night here in Yarralumla. It's not Yarralumla, here in Canberra, at the lodge. And so I called Mr Howard and I woke him up. I told him what was going on. He said, please put Mrs Kovco on the phone, which I did. And it was a lot of one-way traffic, a lot of very bad language. And when she passed the phone back to me, he said, Brendan, can I speak to you somewhere away from the family? And I stepped out onto the tarmac expecting to get an ear lashing, and instead John Howard said to me, Brendan, I admire what you're doing. You're doing the right thing. I feel great sympathy for this family as I do for you. If you need to call me any time through the night, please do so. So that, amongst many of the reasons, was why I was of the view that we, and I certainly, would stay in support of John Howard. When what would happen is periodically there would be issues around leadership, as you all know, and many of you reported on it and observed it. But I remember in mid-2006, Peter Costello again was essentially challenging John Howard, as were Peter Costello's supporters, to consider his position and perhaps retire as Prime Minister, and presumably Peter Costello become the leader. What used to really get on our nerves was that Peter did not ever say, if and when Mr Howard chooses to retire as Prime Minister, I, Peter, will put my name forward to the party room for the consideration of my colleagues. Quite rightly, the leadership of the party is determined by the members of the Liberal Party room. Instead, not only Peter but his strongest backers were of the view that in some way it was a position to be passed from John Howard, in this case to Peter Costello. And that really, really upset a lot of us. As we went through 2007, we were 3 months into that year, and Peter Costello said to me one day, referring to Gary's comments about disunity, he said, have you noticed we're getting leaks from the Cabinet? We haven't had it before. And I said, yeah, I have. I said, it's not me. And he said, I know that. And he nominated a particular individual who joined the Cabinet that year, and I said, well, I have no idea. Peter Costello's budget, in my opinion, in 2007 was his best since 1996. And when I reached the conclusion myself that it was all over was in late June 2007 when the news poll published, the most authoritative, as we all know, of the published polls, gave the coalition a 10-point two-party preferred deficit. We also had Tony Abbott several times describe Kevin Rudd as a younger version of John Howard. In my opinion, the electorate heard that and thought, yeah, that's exactly what we're looking for. When Kim Beazley was replaced by Kevin Rudd in December 2006, I think John Howard, John can only speak for himself, I think John was of the view that he could still beat Beazley, but Rudd was a different kettle of fish altogether. But the die had been cast. In my humble opinion, if Peter Costello had done, perhaps some would say have the courage to do what Paul Keating had done with Hawke, if Costello had said to Howard in mid-2006, OK, John, it's been a privilege to have been your treasurer for 10 years, but you're clearly going to stay. I, Peter, am going to the back bench. I'm pretty confident that John Howard, knowing where all that would have ended up, would have said, well, Peter, let's come to an arrangement, certainly before the end of this year, 2006. Peter instead settled down and continued on with his job. Through 2007, it's often the little things. When I sat in a cabinet meeting and the cabinet was discussing taking over, the federal government taking control of the Burnie Hospital, I thought, what kind of trouble are we in when the federal government is having a cabinet discussion about a hospital on the northwest coast of Tasmania? And it was a reflection, in my opinion, that we were in a lot of trouble. In relation to work choices, Gary and Phil and many others paid the price for what we as a cabinet decided to do. We had 3 meetings on work choices. I remember my own contribution, I'd never speak of what anyone else says, but my own contribution was that we are not here for the sake of being here. We are here to do what is best and right for the country, and in my opinion, this labour market reform and rationalising all of these Commonwealth and state pieces of legislation is long overdue, an essential part of our productivity going forward. And of course it played a significant role in helping Australia through the global financial crisis. Tom said in his, and then at the APEC meeting, it's been well reported that Mr Downer convened a meeting of the Cabinet Ministers. We were, I think, a 12, perhaps even a 14-point two-party preferred deficit in news poll at the time. Downer convened this meeting to ask, with John Howard's knowledge and approval, I understand, to ask us what we thought. 3 Cabinet Ministers were not present, Tony Abbott, Helen Coonan and Mal Brough. The rest of us were all there. And I remember asking Downer, I said, well, John Howard's forgotten more about politics than the rest of us will ever know. Does John Howard think we can win the election? Downer said no. I said, right. Does John Howard believe he can hold his own seat? And Downer said, maybe on a good day. So I was of the view, I can only speak for myself, I was the view, okay, it's too late, but if John Howard chooses to go, that's entirely his business. But I'm not going to be party to anything that pushes him to leave the leadership of the party. Apart from anything else, the people who are completely committed to John Howard in the electorate will abandon us. And I think it's fair to say the Labor Party did that when they got rid of Rudd in 2010. And I'd also say, I haven't said this before publicly, on the Saturday night of the dinner at APEC, Peter Costello pulled me out of the canapes and the reception and asked me if I'd go for a walk with him. So we went for a walk around the Opera House. And he said to me, Brendan, if John Howard goes, and I think he should, he said, I've had a look at it and you clearly have the numbers to be deputy if I become the leader. And I said, Peter, I can't believe you're thinking this way, but I have already said that if John Howard goes, it's entirely his doing to go. I'm not going to be party to anything that sees John Howard pushed from office. And And Peter said, well, we could, of course, delay the election till early in 2008. There are some things that we could do, which John Howard, for reasons that are fairly clear, would not be able to do. And I just said, well, look, firstly, in terms of whether I would have the numbers or support or not, that's not something that I've given any thought to at all. But I won't be party to any sort of push on John Howard. Tom in his introduction thought that maybe 6 months out from the election I would not have considered myself being John Howard's immediate successor. In fact, I had not ever dreamt that that would happen. The assumption that all of us had, including me, was that Peter Costello would be the next leader of the Liberal Party following the election, whether we won or we lost, losing more likely than winning. And on the Saturday of the election itself, as we all do, we're running around polling booths, in my case in Bradfield, and I received a phone call from Tony Staley. And Tony said, Brendan, in the event we don't win today, would you consider running as deputy to Peter? And I said, Tony, it's election day. It's not over until it's over. But if we don't win, perhaps we'll have a talk about it tomorrow. And then that following Sunday morning, we'd lost, and I spent several hours talking to my wife and my key supporters and had made a decision that I would run for deputy, assuming that there would be a large field running for deputy, including Joe Hockey, Julie Bishop and a number of others, and Peter would be the leader. And I was literally on the phone to Joe Hockey at midday talking about this when the news came through that Peter Costello would not accept nor seek the leadership of the Liberal Party. And Malcolm Turnbull was an immediate candidate. I thought about it a lot, and it was not until late in the Monday afternoon that I'd made the decision that I would run. So in hindsight, which is a great thing, my kids have got it, in hindsight, and Phil touched on this, would we have won if we'd changed the leader? Personally, I don't think so. I think we might have lost for different reasons. The three reasons that we lost were longevity, and when I became the leader and had access to all of the internal polling, there was a woman in a focus group in Mayo in December 2006, and she had said of Mr. Howard, she said, I respect Mr. Howard, I love Mr. Howard, but I'm over him. It's time for a change. And I likened it in many ways after the election loss as the electorate putting down a much-loved family pet. And I'm glad I didn't say that earlier because Warren would have done a cartoon. But, and when I say the family pet, I mean the government. I don't mean Mr. Howard. But it was longevity. And the three principal leaders of the government, John and Alexander and Peter, all of whom did an outstanding job for our country, had been there in their faces for 11 and a half years. They wanted a change. And when they were hearing people on our side saying, well, the other guy is a young version of the guy we love and respect, that was reinforcing it. And then further, as Phil said, every time we produced a policy which was clearly attractive to the electorate, the Labor Party would simply match it. The second reason we lost was on the symbolism of climate change. The electorate had yet to be introduced to the economics of it, which is one of the reasons why I'm running the war memorial and not the country. And the third reason was overreach on work choices. And by the time some adjustments had been made to work choices and we had a new salesman, it was too late. Thank you, Tom.
So we need to ask you three quickly. Did the change from Beazley to Rudd alter your view of your likely electoral fortunes? Gary?
I thought while Beazley was still there was always a chance for a shift, because I thought when really push comes to shove, as much as Beazley was sort of warm and fuzzy to a lot of people, I think he had also been around way too long in their minds. So
Kevin was a better prospect as far as you could see.
Yeah, so it's you know, I hadn't realised it was actually Tony Abbott that made that comment. I know there was that general perception out there that you know, Rudd was trying to be me too, and John Howard.
No, we got a transcript.
But I've got...
He was also the one that said in 2001, he said, oh, well, after the election, it'll be John Howard for 2 years and Peter Costello for 1, or John Howard for 1 and Peter Costello for 2. That was Tony's contribution, which then allowed Labor to say John Howard's only plan is retirement.
Yeah.
Phil, how did you see it, the change of leadership?
Look, at the time of the change, I was still quite confident about our fortunes. I thought we were still in there with a shot. Yes, they did know Beazley, but I thought Kevin just came across at times a little bit too smarmy, and was speaking in very elitist terms, and that wouldn't cut through.
Too much specificity.
With the electorate, absolutely. With the electorate. Interestingly enough, if I fast forward to the 2010 election, because I contested that election, I was tracking, and Kevin was the Prime Minister, I was tracking extremely well in the electorate. The hatred towards Rudd was palpable. And on the Wednesday afternoon, in one of the dead red parts of my electorate, I was getting absolutely positive feedback and to get rid of this guy. The next morning, on the Thursday, they had the change of leadership to Gillard. That same, so 24 hours later, I'm in the same area. The mood had totally changed. So, so that was a fast forwarding. But at the time of the Beazley-Rudd move, I thought we were still in there with a chance.
And Brendan?
I didn't really know what to make of it. It meant there was going to be a new game when the change occurred. And I actually felt very sorry for Kim Beazley. But I think John Howard nailed it in that radio interview some years earlier when he questioned whether Kim had the ticket to be Prime Minister. Someone said to me once, Brendan, you're not mad or bad enough to be Prime Minister, and perhaps the same could be said of Kim.
But not of John Howard.
Not of John Howard, no.
And when, Brendan, when Alexander Downer had that conversation at Goolwa, we need a really big fight with the Labor Party on something. What might it have been?
I don't know. Yeah.
So your view was pretty well theirs, which is most of the things in your agenda you had achieved?
I thought, look, the budget, as I say, in 2007, I think was one of Peter's very best. And if you look at the policy platform that we took to 2007 election, there was some very good policy in there, particularly around home ownership and supporting it and increased support for families. But the electorate had stopped listening. And a lot of the really good things that the government did through that period, people were just, they'd made up their minds, and they weren't vocal about it. There was another quiet Australians moment, if you like, and they had, look, in my electorate I was bleeding on Hanif, Hicks, asylum seekers, Iraq, climate change, all of that sort of stuff. But most people, very respectful of Mr. Howard, and didn't really say too much about it, but they'd stopped listening to what we were offering. And of course Rudd, and it was clever, during the election campaign, of course he said, enough, no more spending, we're not going to spend any more. And during the campaign I was up in Bonner, and I was going along with Ross Vasta, the member, the candidate, and we were going to announce $500,000 for a set of traffic lights in his electorate. And as these guys know, that stuff is really important in marginal seats. And then 2 hours before the event, I got a phone call to say, I know the Prime Minister's coming to launch the traffic lights. And I thought, gee, things are bad. So when the Prime Minister's got to do it. But,
the breakthrough issue for you, what might it have been in Eden Monaro, Gary?
What might have been?
Yeah, something to excite the electorate.
Well,
other than traffic lights.
Look, I don't think... Similarly, I made various announcements of key sort of projects in different places that I'd been working on for ages that I managed to get over get the money to do it. But you know, it was sort of a, oh, well, thank you, so what? Response. So I don't think... I agree with Brendan. People had stopped listening and they just had made up their mind that well, you've been great, and a lot of people said that to me, you know, great local member, Gary, and that, but, you know, we just got to make a change.
Was that your
same people
experience,
sort of
Phil?
saying a couple of years later, and well, even today when I do constituent interviews, as I call them in my local supermarket, they say, "Oh, Jesus, we made a mistake back then."
Well, absolutely. But first of all, can I just go back to the big issue? There's no bigger issue than work choices to contrast with the ALP. I think labour market reform was possible and it would have been saleable. I think the end product was perhaps just a bridge too far for people to accept, and was such an easy scare campaign to make, and an easy issue to get the unionists who came from very well-regarded professions that I mentioned out there talking to the mums and dads. That was very easy. But the other thing is that our economic credentials of being good economic managers came into question by splashing money into areas which traditionally a federal government would not get involved in. And then, of course, on November the 7th, in the middle of the election campaign, we had an interest rate increase. So all of a sudden we thought, hang on, so there's a lot of money being spent here, but yet we're also having an interest rate increase of 25 basis points increase on that time. So it countered that idea that we would continue being good economic managers. On Gary's point that he made there, and also your point about stop this thing, I think there's certainly a lot of truth to that. There was certainly also a disconnect in the electorate's understanding of exactly what their intention is. 12 months after the election, I was having people stopping me saying, "Hey, how are you doing up in Canberra?" I said, "Well, I'm no longer there. You guys voted me out." "Oh, no, we voted the government out, not you." So it's, so thank you very much for that. No, it was John. John lost his seat, not you. I said, no. So
it was a job lot. Anyway, our time is out. Would you please thank our panellists this afternoon?